honored to have Jeff Goodell join us. For those of you who probably saw, his book published last year, The Heat Will Kill You First, was a New York Times bestseller. And of course, as somebody interested in this topic, I was immediately, ran out to get it as soon as I could. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book, and I don't know how many of you in here have already read it, and if you haven't, you're all getting a copy tomorrow, is you were able to do something that I think really hasn't been done yet, and that is to humanize the issue of extreme heat. We've had people in the past write books about the health impacts of extreme heat, but you did it with such compelling narrative that really place the reader, in those situations. And so I really thank you for that, because I don't think we had that before that book. And so I assume that, let's see, you recently, or I guess before the book, you decided to really understand the lived experience of heat and moved to Austin, Texas. That's what you did? Yeah. So years ago, I'm going to just get started right in, and you wrote a book about Miami and sea level rise, giving kind of a glimpse into the future of what an underwater Miami would look like. And we have quite a few folks here from Miami. I'm not sure if you were familiar with that work, but now you're living in the heat zone in Austin. So what do you see are the long-term impacts? Just massive areas of the U.S. uninhabitable?
Is that working? Okay. First, I want to say how honored I am to be here and humbled I am to be here. I know many of you from reporting and working on the book. I feel like I've already learned a lot in the last 2 hours. I feel like you guys should be talking to me more than me talking to you, but I'm happy to share my experiences. And I'm also, actually, I'm a little confused. I didn't realize you were hosting the Heat Woodstock here. I would have worn a tie-dye shirt, and we have the Red Wolf pubs.
We just need everybody to keep their clothes on. That's the rule.
So I got a question: who's going to end up being remembered as the Jimi Hendrix and the Janis Joplin from this one? That's what we're not clear. But it's very great, the feeling and vibe of everyone here. So what did you ask me? Oh, about whether things will be uninhabitable.
Yeah. What is the future you see here? Where is this going?
Oh, it's very straightforward. It's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter until we stop burning fossil fuels, and the scope and scale of that is entirely under our control in certain ways. I think that in the biggest sense, with climate, we are, and heat in particular, especially heat, because there's, when I started this book in 2018. There was a few people who are in this room who were thinking about it, but there was nobody really thinking about it. And I think on the heat part, but also in the climate thing in general, we're just at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning of the story. I mean, we are just, understanding the basic outlines of the implications of what we're doing to our world. And we're just at the beginning of understanding what the consequences of heat will be. It's easy to talk about sort of thermal limits for our bodies and the need to plant shade trees and things like that, but we don't really understand what it's going to do to, food crops, to what the political implications will be for migration, what it's going to do to disease patterns. There are so many consequences to rising heat that we're just beginning to understand the psychological implications. Bill mentioned, the difference in psychological kind of preparedness and performance during heat. We're seeing that with test scores and things like that. I mean, it's just, violence, war. I mean, there's just so much we don't understand. And I spent, 3 years writing this book, and, there's still so much that I don't understand, and new stuff that has happened. This is a very long-winded answer, I know, but on this idea of sort of uninhabitability, I mean, Elon thinks we can live on Mars, right? And we can send people down to the Mariana Trench, and the question is not whether we can survive. Humans are like cockroaches, right? I mean, on certain levels, humans can survive all kinds of things. The question is who, and in what way, and at what cost. Those are the complicated questions. It's not a binary, can we survive or can we not? It's who survives. Who makes the line between, the cooled and the damned? And where do we draw that line? And how equitable is that line? And what are the consequences of massive migrations and food crop failures and things like that? Those are the things that I think are the most alarming and concerning, is these, cascading consequences.
Yeah, and on the topic of, the fact that we're at the very, very beginning, and I actually do agree with you on that, is that there's so much we don't know. Fortunately, we've had quite a bit of investment and attention on the urban heat island effect, and to the point where we are starting to really understand how it works, but more importantly, what the interventions are to try and reduce the impact of the urban heat island effect. I know in your book you wrote a little bit about rural communities, and you know that that's one of our core themes here. And in a lot of cases, we see that rural communities have actually higher rates of heat-related illness than their urban counterparts. So I'm just really curious, as to, we're just learning, and then the who is impacted, connecting those two thoughts. We have a large numbers of people, millions of people, who don't live where they have access to a cooling center. And so just curious, what your experience was like thinking about working in rural, the rural question around heat. There was quite a bit in there about certainly farm workers, but there are many people who are not farm workers who also live in rural areas.
Yeah, my mom is one of them. She lives in Red Bluff, California, a very hot place, and I see the impacts of this extreme heat on her and on all of her neighbors and on their way of life. And it's really true that much of the research and media attention is focused on cities, and for good reason, because a lot of people live in cities, and because there is this thing called the urban heat island effect, and they are hotter places. But the question about people living in rural areas, it's much more complex. It's not like you can just put up a pop-up cooling center in the middle of Montana, right? And like everybody drives to it. I mean, the solutions are much more complex, and there's also the question of isolation, which, as we all know from heat interventions, this idea that we need to communicate better, check in on people. There are a lot of people in rural areas who are not checked in on, and live in really poor conditions, difficult conditions, uninsulation, no air conditioning, all those kinds of things. And we haven't even begun to think about dealing with that. And that's one of the reasons I'm really glad that it's on your agenda here, because I go to like dozens of these conferences, and I don't think it's ever come up, which is really, so it's really cool that this is a subject here, because it's not in most conversations about this.
It really isn't. I think, but to give some hope on that topic, FEMA last year hosted its first ever heat summit, and my colleague attended. And at the time, he was really the only person that brought up the topic of rural heat vulnerability. Fast forward to this year, they do the same thing again, and there are now multiple people talking. And New York Times this week wrote about rural heat vulnerability. And I think it's starting to make its way into the conversation. But it's a huge challenge, because as you've pointed out already, what we're talking about there is magnifying already existing and underlying inequities in rural communities. And I don't know the answer, right? But certainly you're very clear in making the case about what we need to do on a larger scale about decarbonizing the economy. But saying these things and doing these things are two very different things. I'm just wondering, what's it going to take?
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I don't think there's when I went to Alaska with President Obama in 2015 and got to spend a couple of hours talking with him, and he he talked about this idea of, people having oh shit moments where something happens and they realize the scope and scale of this climate crisis we're talking about. And for him, it was seeing the coral reefs where he swam as a kid bleached and gone away. And I remember my very first kind of research trip I did. I wrote a book about the coal industry in 2001 when the Bush-Cheney energy plan was released. And the New York Times called me up, and at that time I've been writing a lot about crime and technology in New York. And the New York Times called me up and said, Jeff, I think that coal's going to have a big comeback in America because of this Bush-Cheney energy plan. Do you want to go to West Virginia and write about it? And I'd never read anything about energy, anything about climate. And when I remember the call from my editor, and the little cartoon above my head was, coal? What coal? What do you mean coal? We burn coal in America? I thought that was something that happened in Charles Dickens novels, And my understanding of electricity was like a lot of Americans' understanding of electricity which is that it kind of flowed down from a golden bowl in the sky, and where it came from, nobody knows. But on that trip and writing that piece about the coal industry in West Virginia in 2001 was my oh shit moment, and part of my oh shit moment was then to go out on a research vessel in the North Atlantic with some scientists who were looking at sedimentary data in the North Atlantic trying to reconstruct past oceans. And we would sit out on the fantail with a bottle of bourbon, watch the flying fish, and this scientist, whose name was Lloyd Kegwin, a great guy, he was obsessed with this question, what is it going to take? He had this idea that when a big hurricane comes out and wipes out an American city, people will wake up, right? Well, we've had a few of those, and some people maybe have woken up at it, but I don't. What I've learned from then and thinking about that since then is I don't think there is a wake up moment. I mean, there's a wake up moment for you and for me and for your friends and my friends and every individual person, but I don't think that there's going to be or will be all of a sudden, climate is the #1 issue in the world, and we've all woken up and we've all decided, oh my God, we got to save this beautiful planet and this climate that sustains us. I think it's a mud slog. I think it's every person, a different thing will be the thing. Some people it's home insurance, some people it's Zika range changes, some people it's sea level rise, some people it's the risk of a heat Katrina in Phoenix, some people it's seeing their great aunt die in an apartment because she didn't have air conditioning. Who knows what those triggers will be, but I don't think there's going to be a single what will it take thing.
You bring up a good point you mentioned hurricanes. One of the things I've said a lot is what's hard about heat, and I've been doing this for about a decade, right, is that when I look out my window and it's 85 degrees, it looks exactly the same as when I look out my window, it is 100 degrees. There is no moment where there is this huge catastrophic event that impacts the landscape so that people, when a tornado comes through, everybody knows what just happened. And, heat doesn't have that kind of impact. And I think that actually makes it difficult to capture the imagination around the risk of heat. And there's an enormous miscommunication and misunderstanding about heat risk.
Yeah, totally. And Bill mentioned it when he was talking a few minutes ago about our language about heat is confused. You mentioned the titles of all these movies. Hot is kind of good. I worked at Rolling Stone for 25 years. Every summer we would put out a hot issue. And that was not about climate change, trust me. I was just in the Austin airport the other day. I live in Austin. And I was in the bookstore, and I was looking, of course, for my book, as every author does. I found this book that I thought was amusing. It was called Austin is Cool. And it was about all the cool things in Austin, right? The bands, the music, the tacos. Then I walked out, I bought the book because I thought it was just funny for me to have. And I walked out, and on the wall, outside of the bookstore, there was like a mural on the wall, a promotional thing for Austin. And it was, Austin is hot. Hot view, hot music, hot food. And it was like, okay, so right here is the confusion about what we mean when we talk about heat. It's like, is Austin cool? Yes. Is it hot? Yes. But is it hot and cool, or what do you mean? You know, and it's embedded this confusion about understanding. So it's not only an invisible killer, as people talk about, but it's a confused killer, right? And the media doesn't help, right? I've been on a rampage for a while about media. Whenever they talk about heat waves, they show kids playing in fountains or eating ice cream cones or playing at the beach. And it's like, okay, so this is the message.
Oh, that's my pet peeve. That's my pet peeve. I've reached out to people in the media and I've said, you would never dream of publishing such a photo in an article that talks about a hurricane coming.
Right.
I mean, people are going to die, and you've got kids playing in a sprinkler.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think the cultural, there's just a lot of cultural noise around communicating about heat that I think is starting to change now. But this goes to the heat ranking thing, heat naming stuff, all these other things is how do we communicate the risks of heat and what are the kind of innovations that we need. In Texas, where I live, I was at a Starbucks the other day, walking out of Starbucks just on the public street, and there was a sign, presumably put up by the city of Austin, about what to do in case of a flood. Like right there, just like on the sidewalk. Everybody knows what to do in case of a flood. They know where to go, they know who to call, they know FEMA knows what to do. Everybody knows what to do when there's a risk of a flood. There's none of that for heat.
That's true. I think there are certainly very good people working on that.
Totally.
Right?
This is what you guys are doing. It's so cool.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that, some of the folks here, such a diverse group of folks here. We've got folks that, a lot of clinicians from different clinics and people who work with those clinicians to, as Dr. Cheryl Holder, I was talking with her earlier today. I don't see her right now, but, there she is. One of the things she often talks about is that clinicians are some of the most trusted individuals in society, first nurses, and then medical doctors, pharmacists, and everything. And so her organization's mission is to educate clinicians so they know how to talk about climate change and certainly about heat. And I definitely think that's one way that's certainly a very important route to get people thinking about it. And then I think about all the other people in our communities that also hold those positions of trusted partner. Faith leaders, for example, also hold positions as trusted. And I'm just, the idea of trusted partners is a way to deliver this message to kind of counteract that misperception of heat. That seems like a small thing that's going to happen little by little, but from what I hear you saying, you think it actually is going to take individual by individual.
Yeah. And I just thought of another great example of how we miscommunicate about heat and send the wrong messages sometimes. Because of this heat wave for the last 10 days or something, I've been doing a lot of media. And I was on CNN the other day with a person who will remain nameless, but he's a well-known doctor, person who's on CNN a lot of times. And they were asking about, we talked about climate and all that, and then they were thinking, okay, so what can you do? What do you need to do personally during a heat wave? And he went first, and the first thing he said is the most important thing you can do is put on sunscreen. And I was like, are you kidding me? You're talking about a heat wave, the number one thing you say that everybody should do is put on sunscreen? And it was just like, oh my God. So we're still, and this is from a doctor, right, who is on CNN talking to millions of people, and is telling them to put on sunscreen, which on some 5th, 7th, 8th level is interesting, but as the number one thing you do in a heat wave is put on sunscreen, it's that's not going to save grandma roasting in her apartment. Oh, she died, but she had sunscreen on.
Thank goodness. Yeah, to the same end, sometimes, certainly air conditioning is one of the best adaptations we have for heat, but so many times I hear people say, get into an air-conditioned environment. And then they stop at that point, and I think to myself, it's not as if all these people are sitting around going, really, air condition? I had no idea. I'll just totally go into my air condition. And we haven't yet really addressed how to help people on the scale that we need to help them who don't have access to air conditioning, can't afford their air conditioner, and really give them practical advice. I mean, I know there's tons of people in this room who are working with communities every day, and they're thinking about, you know, arm and foot immersion, how to use fans properly, how to use cooling. But that information, it just seems to get lost in the noise.
Yeah. I mean, air conditioning drives me crazy. I mean, it's obviously a really important tool, but the problem with any kind of discussions about air conditioning beyond the knowledgeable people like everyone in this room is that it's seen as sort of a fix, right? It's like, well, why are you worried about extreme heat? Why are you worried about climate change? Just get more people air conditioning and everything will be okay. And it's like, no, you know, that's not how it's going to work. You know, there are 750 million people on the planet who don't even have access to electricity, much less air conditioning, right? And we're not going to air condition the oceans. We're not going to air condition the forests. We're not going to air condition the lands where our crops are grown. I mean, this whole extreme heat question is so much bigger than that. But America loves techno fixes, and they love the idea that, oh, well, just crank up the air conditioning, buy the poor people more air conditioners, and everything will be okay. And that's like the end of the policy discussion.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and one of the things that we kind of talked about via our email exchange was this idea of, you know, nostalgia around heat. I often hear people, especially if you live in the Sun Belt, you know, region, it's like, oh yeah, it's hot in Atlanta because it's Atlanta, you know, and it's hot in the South because it's the South. And I don't think we've been able to really help people understand that this is not, in fact, the heat from when your grandparents were growing up. I mean, it's going to be 80 degrees all night tonight.
Right.
And that's becoming more and more common. And so I think, how can we get people to, you know, nostalgia is just so powerful. And people think, oh yeah, when I used to go to my grandma's house and she had no air conditioning, we would have the fans running and sit on the front porch, and I hear all these stories all the time. That just doesn't play anymore.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think about that in Texas a lot. I mean, obviously there was a lot of people living in Texas before air conditioning, and we had dog trot houses, and there was all kinds of ways of building that was very different before you had air conditioning. But you know, what this touches on that I think goes to one of my kind of biggest concerns about the whole climate question, but heat in particular too, is this shifting baseline idea that, you know, it's sort of like with COVID. You know, COVID happened and everybody was like, oh my God, this is terrible, people are dying. And now people are still dying, but it's just background noise. And, you know, I'm very concerned that, you know, part of our adaptation strategy will be just to say, oh, this is how it's always been. It's, you know, we've always had 1,000, 1,500 people dying in Phoenix over the summer. That's just the way it is. That's what life is like. And, you know, that, you know, you have a couple thousand people die on a religious pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. That's just how our planet is like now. We just accept that, and we just, you know, think of it as the way it's always been, and don't register that this is a completely human artifact, that our climate now is completely a human artifact, that it wasn't that way before, and that we'll just keep kind of adapting in that horrible way of accepting more and more chaos, more and more tragedy, more and more loss as the way life is on Earth, and it's not.
Yeah, the nostalgia seems to lead to complacency in some very serious ways. So we've talked about, you know, a lot of the issues and challenges around this work, but I want to kind of end on a little bit of a positive note and ask you, what gives you hope in this work?
Well, you know, hope is a complicated word, but
they're waiting.
I mean, you know, one of the things that gives me hope is like right here, right now. Just like talking to all of you. You guys are all incredibly educated about this, thoughtful about this, working incredibly hard, trying to change things. people ask me, Jeff, you've been writing about climate change for more than 2 decades. Why aren't you like sitting in your basement drinking bourbon and scrawling on the wall with crayons about, what we've done to our world? And it's partly because of being around people like all of you. I meet so many people who are deeply committed to change and to making a better world. People like Peter Kalmus here is a great scientist who's working really hard. Bill, so many of you have, dedicated your lives to helping people understand this and thinking about how to motivate others to understand this. And, I've done my little part just by telling stories about this. I don't pretend to be any kind of political activist or know anything about like what is going to inspire political change, but I do know that I can tell stories and that I want to tell stories that matter. And I feel like in some small way, when I hear from readers and things, I feel like my stories that I tell sometimes matter in a small way, and I feel like this strong sense of community with people like all of you here and in other places. And that gives me a lot of hope because, it's going to be, we're moving into a time of tremendous loss and suffering. There's no question about that. But we're also moving into, a time when action, connections matter more than ever before. And I think there's a lot of strength, if not hope, to be drawn from that.
I think that's really great. A lot of times if you work in climate resilience, what they say is the number one factor in communities that are resilient is social capital, those who have relationships with one another. And I know a lot of us in this room are working on this topic and can feel just like enormous, right? And we're kind of doing that for each other. Julie Turchon is here from Noah's NIHIS, and I know Julie's been working on this for a long time. And, in getting NOAA and other coordinating federal agencies where there, maybe has not been actually a lot of his, desire and movement toward it. How do you keep, the will, the interest, the passion to keep going? And I think certainly building this relationship, this is also what gives me a lot of hope and energy to keep talking about and thinking about and working on this topic. So thank you, because I actually think we've had several people say, like, how do we navigate the political environment here? I actually think narrative is one of the key ways we do it, right? I think that's one of the ways in which we can, I know that when I tell a story, we're not telling a story about, who is aligned with which political party. We're just telling a story about people and about us and about what we're doing and what we're going to do. And I actually think that is an incredibly important and powerful contribution to the work that all of us are doing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.